We're going to turn in our Bibles to 1 Timothy chapter 3, and we're going to look at the closing section of this chapter. And you might think there's only a couple of verses, but there's a lot in these verses. As I started preparing and doing this, I have enough material that's going to take a few weeks because there's so much in it. I could skip over it, and yes, but that's not me. And our topic tonight is, how should we worship? Well, the actual question is, how should we conduct ourselves in church? And that's dealing with worship. And this is the first part. Because it says, as a church, that means being part of the household of God. How should we conduct ourselves in God's presence when we come to worship Him? When a person of importance comes and pays a visit to a church, what happens? You know, if I said that the PM was coming next Sunday, what would we do? Would we do anything different? What would we do different? An extra flowers. Would we present ourselves any different from what we are? I'd be wearing a suit. Not likely. Thanks. But usually what we do, we would go to great lengths because there's somebody of importance. We would prepare ourselves for that person. But when it comes to worship in our churches, our attitude, what is it when we come to worshiping the one who is worthy of worship? How do we look at it? Because quite often, it's not taken as seriously as it should be. As one commentator has said, worship today has taken so many different routes, and the purpose of the church has taken so many different turns for so many that literally it's utterly shameful. There is this sense of shame that we have taken the concept of the nearness of God, of the goodness of God towards us, and we've reduced it to something that is trivial. This idea that if we have a good, exciting program and we label it worship, it is something that we use to get God to come near to us by the things that we do. Yet, as he rightly points out, the nearness of God ought to change the way that we conduct ourselves. The fact that God would come near to us should be something that informs our worship and makes our worship. We don't have to create worship to make God come to us. God's already here. But what effect does He have upon us? We need to recognize and understand the purpose of the church, and its very existence is to worship the one who has made it all possible. In chapter 1 through 3, instructions have been given to make sure that the right people are in leadership. In chapters 4 through 6, it deals with issues that are going wrong. And in these 3 verses, stuck literally in the middle of this chapter, Paul is saying to Timothy, pay attention. What I'm about to say to you is the most significant purpose of the church. These verses lay out for us the purpose and the mission of the church and how we should conduct ourselves as its people. Now we're going to break it up a little bit. Focus on your conduct is the thought that is here. Focus on your conduct. And the verse is the plan in 3:14. These things I write to you, though I hope to come to you shortly. The whole purpose, the whole point of everything that Paul is addressing is that we ought to know how to conduct ourselves in the church. And he makes the plan very clear, his intentions. He has every intention to come and visit Timothy in Ephesus in person. That was what he wanted to do. And most of us have been there. We have intentions of visiting a loved one or going to visit this person, but, things just happen that stop us from meeting that intention. But here, due to time constraints, and Paul was a busy person, there were many churches that needed Paul's assistance. So Paul had to prioritize and use his energy as to which churches needed him the most. So he couldn't just pack up and say, well, I'm going to Ephesus, get somebody else to look after you or do this. No, he had to prioritize where his ministry would be among the churches. Now, that's not to say that what was happening at Ephesus wasn't serious. It wasn't something that could be taken lightly. It was a matter of supply and demand. So the Ephesians would have to wait a little longer until he could make that personal appearance. That's just the way things were. And it's important for Paul to communicate to the church at Ephesus. So he puts his words into writing to them. And Paul is saying very bluntly, I want you to know. I want the church to know. I want every church to know and understand the purpose and function of God's people. I want everyone to know. I want you to understand that you're in God's house. And because you're in God's house, you must know how to conduct yourselves at all times in every kind of situation. Remember, you're in God's house. You take him everywhere you go. So do not behave like the pagans do. Don't try to be like the world or bring the world into the church. You already have God's presence with you because you are in the house of God. And this should motivate you to live your life with this thought in mind. You're different. Recognize it. And be different for God is the difference between you and the world in which you live. Now, most of us would understand that. And we'd say, yes, amen to Paul. I understand that I'm part of God's family. I understand that by faith and trust in the Lord Jesus Christ, my life has changed and it's being changed. I am different from the world in which I live. I'm part of it, but I have a different focus. I have a different behavior that's expected of me. And so Paul is saying, recognize this. You're part of my family. You're part of God's family. Don't be ashamed of it. But understand there are standards that must be upheld. In verse 15, he talks about the priority. But if I am delayed, I write so that you may know how you ought to conduct yourself in the house of God. Paul conveys the thought, hey, I might be delayed in getting to see you in person. And the actual original word there, but if I wait, which is what it means and what he's saying, I write meaning that I must prioritize. I must wait and decide which church needs my attention the most. I can't just drop everything and come to you straight away like I want to. I have to prioritize. There are others that need my attention. And the question that comes to mind is why Paul would choose to do this. And the answer is, and we're sort of talking about, why would Paul wait or choose to wait? And we need to understand that Paul's workload is immense in the things that God has given him to do. God has a plan for this man. He is the man of the moment. Now that doesn't mean he's indispensable, but God has given him a job to do. And so he has all these demands upon his time. And so he cannot give those at Ephesus the guarantee that he could free himself enough to leave what he was doing to get to Ephesus anytime soon. he just couldn't do it. And that's what he's saying. I choose to wait because there are priorities that I must make sure that I meet. Now, we need to realize that every church faces issues and problems. And the early church was no different. But you know what? There was only a limited number of apostles who had to spread themselves thin around all the different churches that Paul had written to. All the churches that had been established. They needed help. They needed guidance. But you know what? They didn't have a great deal of people that were available to meet all the church's demands. And remember, the church is just beginning. So they have many questions, many issues, many problems that had to be sorted. And they needed mature spiritual leaders to be able to guide them in that area. Yet with all the problems that Paul faced, he had written to the church at Ephesus to address. And he addressed the false teaching. He addressed the myths being perpetuated from within. He addressed the women demanding to be recognized and teach in the church. All were impacting the church and the way they were supposed to worship God. They were having an impact. And that's what problems and issues do. They have an impact. And of course, if you think about it, what's the best way to fix those problems? What would have been the ideal situation? For Timothy, at least, anyway. Paul, come here. Fix them up. Tell them. Get it straight. And of course, the best thing was if Paul had come there in person, because Paul was not one of those people that take a back seat and let things happen. Paul was a hands-on, take charge of the situations. And if he'd arrived at Ephesus, seeing the problems, he would have taken no time at all to put things right. So having Paul there in person would have made things easier to get things done. He's a no-nonsense type of guy. He didn't put up with people who were doing the wrong things. And no doubt he would have been very upfront and said so to their faces. That's the type of person he was, a straight shooter. And there would have been no mucking around. They would have known Paul's in the house. Paul's going to straighten out the house. Paul's going to deal with all the problem makers. And so Timothy would have said, come on, Paul, hurry up. Come. And the problem would have been sorted. The church would have greatly benefited by his appearance. But Paul says, hang on a minute. I have to wait and prioritize before I can get to see you. So instead, and just as importantly, I'm sending a letter that I've written with my personal instructions for you to follow and do. It's not quite as good as me being there, but it's just as good. I'm giving you instructions. And that is why it's been preserved. That's why we have it kept for us in his word, handed down in the scriptures, for us to know and understand what God requires of a church. Now, particularly here at Ephesus, but not only Ephesus, but for every church that is to come. God has a standard, and he has that standard of behavior that he expects of all those who represent him in the church. The purpose, you may know how you ought to conduct yourselves. Paul wants people to know there's a required standard of conduct that is appropriate when people come to worship in the house of God, or the church as we know it today. And Paul says this is something, and I emphasize this, we ought to know. We ought to know. It's not something that should be taken lightly. It's important. And we need to pay attention to how we gather together to worship. And it's very important. And the word in the original that Paul uses here, he's talking about lifestyle. He's talking about what we do. And it's in reference to how we conduct ourselves when we gather together to worship in the house of God. And that's something we should pay attention. This is something that we ought to know as Christians today. How should we conduct ourselves? What is acceptable to God? And yet too often, when we label something worship, it's interesting. Does it meet the pub test when it comes to what worship is? Too often in our desire to worship, we are looking at creative and novel ways to put things into our program that will draw people closer together to experience the presence of God. So what does that do? It means our reliance then is more on our programs. It's focusing more on people's performance rather than understanding that when I gather together, I'm coming into the presence of God who's already here with me. I don't have to do things to get God to come to worship. He's here. He's here at this moment. So I don't have to do anything special except be here, and God will be here as well. And that should be enough as a Christian for me to want to come to church. But the question is it? And this is why this is so important about worship, because we make worship about us. We make worship about how I feel. We make worship about our programs. We make worship about the person up the front. When really worship is, I've come to meet with God in his house. That's what worship is. That's cutting it right back to bare bones. I've come to meet with God in his house with family members. Every born-again person is a member of God's family. We come together with the same purpose, to be in the presence of God. He's here. But the question is, are we here? Now, it's amazing as a pastor, I can stand here, I can look at you, and some of you I can read. And what I can read is, you don't want to be here. Your minds are somewhere else, but they're not here. You can telegraph whether you're interested or not. And often that's worship is done. And our programs often will cater to keep you from being bored. Now, if I decided to stand on my head and juggle balls and everything else, would I capture your attention? You'd probably think, what an idiot. What an idiot. I'm not getting to you to draw you to the presence of God to worship. You're focusing on me. I'm trying to entertain you. And that's not what worship's about. It's not entertaining. It's being able to come into the presence of God. And this is a big issue. It really is in our modern day churches today. It's a big issue because it's not about our programs. What it comes down to is about our attitudes. It comes down to, as Paul says, our lifestyles. It's about our preparation when we come to church. Who are we meeting with? Do we believe we're doing God a favor by coming? Or are we moved and motivated because of who he is and what he's doing in our lives? It should be that as we gather together, we've got so much to give thanks to God for that he's doing in our lives and the lives of the people that we know, that we want to rejoice and give thanks to God for who he is. You see, I don't have to conjure up an atmosphere of worship, because all that is an artificial means for something that's not there in the first place. If I have to conjure it up, it's not there in the first place. I can't make it happen. I can't motivate you to worship if it's not there in the first place. And yet so often, what we picture as worship, that's exactly what's done. Someone is gearing, someone's pushing, someone's motivating, someone's geeing us up to produce something that's not there. And this is why it's important. This is the issue with much of our worship today. We are reliant on things to put us in the mood to worship. Paul's concern is that we should know, or we ought to know, what is required when we come to worship God in his house. That's what he's saying. We ought to know, as Christians, how to worship God in his house. We should know and understand the reason we gathered together in the first place. He's here with us. And we just want to spend time with him. There's a proposal that you may know how you ought to conduct yourself in the house of God. And this idea of the Greek that brings out the household, it's been something to describe, we've used the household, same word, to describe deacons and elders. When it talks about that these people, these leaders in the church, the biblical role models, they must know how to manage their household well. And it applies to the house of God as well. Not only are pastors and deacons supposed to know how to manage and run their own household, but also the house of God. They set the standard. The term can be used to describe a physical building, and it can mean the members of your family, your household. So it's inclusive of God's temple and God's family. I think I'll put this up. That's Ephesians 2:19 through 22. So then you are no longer foreigners and non-citizens, but you are fellow citizens with the saints and members of God's household, because you have been built on the foundation of the apostles and prophets, with Christ Jesus himself as the cornerstone. In him the whole building, being joined together, grows into a holy temple in the Lord, in whom you also are being built together into a dwelling place of God in the Spirit. Every person who's born again, their body becomes a temple of the Holy Ghost. He lives within us. God's dwelling in us. So everywhere I go, I'm taking God with me. Sometimes we don't get that. But as we gather together, God is here in this place with us. So we get the sense of God's family. We also get the sense he's temple of a physical building. And the contrast is between what we once were, strangers and aliens, but now that has changed. And before I became a Christian, was I interested in church? Was I interested in what people in the church did? I couldn't care less. I had no interest in them at all. But things changed. You see, I was alienated from God. But things changed. And when I became a member of God's family, that changed everything. I've adopted into God's family. Not that I deserved it, but by faith he's placed me there. I didn't put myself into God's family, and neither did you. God puts us in his family and says, you're mine. And that's a tremendous truth and understanding that God's the only one that can kick you out of his family. And he says, once you're mine for eternity. Now that doesn't mean he won't discipline us. He will. But you're mine. And he'll be doing the transforming and the changing. And that's a precious truth. But right now we're part of the body of the family of God. We're not on the outside looking in anymore. We're on the inside looking out. Things have changed. And Paul brings out the thought that as well as being members of God's household, we're part of a physical building called the church. And God is represented in the world by his church, you and I, when we gather together. We then, as I finish up with this thought, is the presence of God. And this is important. When people come to church, who and what are they looking for? What are people looking for when they come to church? And there's a variety of reasons why people come to church. Are they looking to be entertained? Well, sadly, that's what many are. To be entertained by the music, to be entertained by the singers, to be entertained by the pastor, to be entertained. Or are they coming to feel good about themselves? And I've often heard people say, well, Pastor, I've come to feel good about myself. I've been told that the church is a fun place to be. The services are dynamic and really motivating, and people are friendly, and that's why I come. Now, those answers and responses are given by a poll that was taken, a survey. They're the main reasons why people come to church. But it makes you wonder. I think we've lost the perspective of who and what we worship and why we come. We've been caught up in the world to use the world standards of what worship is. As members of the local church, in other words, members here of community church, what do we think about when we come to church? Is it a place and a time where we forget about our troubles? Is it a place where we feel good? We get a good feed, so to speak. We get our batteries charged for the week ahead. If that is what the church is about, we've missed the point of why we're even in existence, if that's all the church means. Now, those things are side benefits, but they're not the main benefits of why we gather together. Church is the place where we come to meet with God. We come to meet with God because He's worthy of our praise and thanks. The scriptures tell us He is the head of the church. Without Him, there is no church. So when we come together, God is already here, present among us. He's already waiting. And yet we use artificial means to stir us up to feel happy so that we can enjoy God's presence. It's not necessary. If we prepared ourselves, we'll enjoy being in His presence, and we'll know that He is with us. And what we present will be normal and natural because it comes from people who are grateful to be part of His family. And I'm going to stress this. I do not have to rock the church off its foundations with loud music to get God's attention. Maybe that's why I'm 3/4 of the way deaf anyway. I wouldn't hear it. But often you can walk into a church, and I've done that when I've gone visiting other churches. I've been blown to the back wall because of the music. It's loud. It gives me a headache. And I certainly can't concentrate on worshipping. And I'm told, well, you're just an old fuddy-duddy. Well, hang on a minute, I've come to worship in the Lord's house. How can I do it if I can't concentrate? You see, I don't have to go over the top by introducing new programs to nurture something that should already be there present. I don't have to find new inviting ways. I just need to enjoy being part of God's household, knowing and understanding that at this very moment, God is here present with me, and I can enjoy His presence here. We represent Him as the church to the world. It is the same understanding of what it means to belong to the family. Now, what does it mean to belong to a family? Most of us come from a family, but what does that mean to belong to a family? Do we all have to be on the same page? Do we always have to be happy? Do we always have to be in agreement? You see, the families that I know of, there are times when you'll be emotional and moved by the things that you're feeling and experiencing in your own personal life. As the Lord has reached and touched your life with a particular scripture or a particular song, or somebody's done something, you're moved. And you move towards God, not away from God, but towards God. And at the same time, most of us enjoy being part of the family. In other words, the family comes together. You enjoy the presence of the family. Being part of the family gives security, at peace, and the presence of each family member's presence. And that same thing should happen when we come to worship God. We should have it from each other. We're here for the same purpose. In other words, I can enjoy God for who He is, and His presence gives me confidence and strength. I don't need to fabricate these things. They're real enough because I understand the family I belong to and how I represent that family both within and outside the physical structure of the church. I'm representing Him wherever I go in the things that I do and say, and that's important. The Ephesian church was not some small, insignificant group of believers. They knew how to behave. They knew how to conduct themselves. And they certainly were capable of cleaning out their own house when it was needed. But they had come to a point where they had forgotten their first love. They were going through the motions when it came to their worship. And Paul says to them, look, you know and understand why I'm writing to you about these things. You have people in the church that are not doing the right thing. They're not living the right life. They're not meeting the godly standards that are required of leadership. And they should know better. Yet they choose to ignore my writings and what I'm saying. Paul says, look, these people that are causing problems within the church are promoting lives. They're teaching wrong things that are not right. They say they are members of God's family, and yet the things they're doing do not honor the family. We ought to be doing better than this. We know what is required, but it seems we've allowed other things to distract and take away our fear and reverence for the Lord and the teachings He has given us. That is a sad reflection, I think, about the church today. We've lost the awe and wonder and reverence of the Lord, who He is. We've lost this fear of who God is. We have put God on our level. He's one of us, yet He's greater than us, and He expects something more. Yet to many, God's my mate, God's my friend, God's my buddy. God wouldn't do this, God wouldn't do that. God would love this, but God wouldn't punish this. We put Him down on a human level. God is above the human level. And we have lost this sense of awe and wonder and majesty of who our God really is when it comes to worship. Now, all I've done is just scratch the surface a little bit. But you see, it's challenging for us today because worship has taken many different paths. And what we say or present as worship doesn't line up to what the Bible has to say. I can never present a program or anything in this church that will make you sense the presence of God. Won't happen. God Himself is here present tonight. But have you come with the right attitude? Have you come with the right lifestyle? Have you come with a heart of gratitude to give thanks to the God who loves you, who died for you, who's promised to do many things for you, just to enjoy His presence? And as we think about it, it's interesting that, you know, when I went courting my wife, I met her in church. I didn't know what she looked like. She was sitting up the front, and all I saw was this long hair that went right down her back. That's the first thing that struck me, and I thought, I've got to meet this lady. I didn't know what she looked like. And we started talking and corresponding and the rest of it. And you know what it's like when you get an interest? You can't wait to spend time with that person. And when you spend time with that person, hey, time doesn't matter. You talk, You communicate. You just love being in that person's presence. And often they don't say anything, but you just enjoy the presence of that one person. Can I ask you tonight, is that how you feel about God? Just enjoying his presence for who he is, because he means so much. As I said, I've just scratched the surface. There's a lot more to come. But we need to think about how I ought to conduct myself in the house of God when it comes to worship. As we close,